Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me early today. I'm going to talk a little bit about geophysical applications for deep foundation sites. We have a very large geophysical group at Terracon Consultants, and I'm going to go through some of the applications that we've used for sites specifically when it comes to drilled shafts, drilled piers, pile driving, things of that nature. So I'd be remiss to mention that fact that we do have a pretty robust deep foundation testing group, which geophysics is a part of. We do have about 8 units of PDA, 2 units using PIT, 40 boxes of TIP, a couple units of CSL. We do have a shaft inspection device now, and several static load testing units. So what is geophysics? Geophysics is using some physical property or process to determine something about the subsurface, and unlike CSI would like you to believe, nothing ever looks like a handgun buried in concrete. So we're trying to interpret what these signals actually mean for the subsurface. We talk about geophysics in levels of confidence. We have low levels of confidence if you do nothing on a site, put some borings on the site, do some test pits, your confidence increases, do some geophysics to help connect the dots. You get a very high confidence product. Really what geophysics is trying to do is reduce those below surface uncertainties. Things like soil and rock properties, which may be important, like bedrock depth, or unknowns including foundations, utilities, tanks, etc., what we call anthropogenic or constructability concerns. It's important to note that geophysics is always part of a smart exploration plan in Terracon. Direct exploration, including the traditional SPT, CPTs, test pits, they're always a part of these types of surveys. Direct exploration is an essential part of geophysics, but combined, we can be more surgical in our direct explorations. The best analogy for this is you get a lot of information from a boring before you're drilling shafts, doing pile driving operations. Get a lot of information from a boring. That's more akin to a laser. Very small beam of light, get a lot of information out of it. We can use it to very accurately measure ground surface. Geophysics is more akin to a floodlight. We don't get as much information about any specific area, but we get a lot of information over a broader area. Method selection becomes really important for geophysics because there'll be firms out there that do a lot of ground penetrating radar, that do a lot of seismic, but choosing the right method, depending on what you're looking for, becomes very important in this service. It is akin to having a toolbox and then selecting a hammer. You have to be careful when you select a hammer because there's 2 famous corollaries that I like to use for that hammer. One is Maslow's hammer. If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But the second is the law of the instrument. Give a small child a hammer and they will find that everything they encounter needs pounding. So you have to be careful when you have one specific method. And so many of the methods I'm about to talk about, I'm just going to gloss over. I'm not going to get into the details of them, but I will be mentioning what methods we've used for specific projects. The first here is bedrock mapping, looking at actual depth or elevation of bedrock below a site. This can have serious implications when doing pile driving or drilled shafts, and in these 2 sites specifically, they did. Determining the right pile length that you need for a site can be important. These 2 sites were done using a combination of borings and seismic refraction. We're able to plot then the actual elevation of these sites, bedrock, below the surface, for a lower cost than just doing a boring every 10 foot on center. Second, although not as big of a problem in this neck of the woods, certainly as you get east of the Mississippi, karst and sinkholes become a bigger detriment to doing any operations on a site. The top left image is electrical resistivity imaging. So the little green blob that extends further down, or several green blobs, those are actual sinkholes or sinkhole cavities. These were later confirmed with borings. You can see on the lower left there, we're actually modeling an area of dark blue that indicated a weaker soil profile in a pile driving operation. And then on the right-hand side here, this was a site. This is a top-down view of a site where they had an open sinkhole and wanted to measure the aerial extent of that sinkhole. Doing the measurement using electromagnetic, in this case, actually found a utility they didn't know existed, which is kind of in that bottom left corner there. So you can find things that maybe you're not expecting on sites when you start to perform geophysical investigations. These two images are done using a towable multi-channel radar array. You can see several instances of constructability concerns for sites that were previously developed, including utilities, previous sinkholes, repaired sinkholes in that left image, but also a former building footprint in that right image. Able to map out the building footprint, avoid it, because obviously when you're trying to drive piles through an old building footprint, it can encounter some difficulties. Construction debris, another big issue on a lot of these sites where you've had them previously developed. This was done doing electromagnetic, just walking up and down the site, mapping the areas, and then going out and doing test pits to actually remove the construction debris before construction started. This is another pile driving operation. Waste fill material, this was fly ash, so there was concern during the pile driving operation for corrosion potential. This is a site that they had done a lot of burying of fly ash in a previous lifetime. The right-hand model, the dark gray, indicates the extent of the fly ash under the site, and you can see the browns indicate the extent of the soil. So you have some significant fly ash on this site. The left image there is a top-down view in reds where the fly ash was most concentrated on this site. Rubble fill material, another extent of construction debris, but this was pile driving operation in Texas where they wanted to map areas where existing rubble fill might impact their ability to drive piles. The red areas in the left-hand models show the extent of the rubble fill. This was done using electrical resistivity imaging. We did several lines across the site, usually I think at a spacing of about 20 feet. So doing these lines allowed us to both map the vertical extent as well as the lateral extent of this rubble fill. They ended up moving the building over so they could drive piles in an easier fashion. Top right image, this was another electrical resistivity image of rubble fill. This using a different 3D modeling program to map the blobs of rubble fill that were previously buried on site. Archaeological studies or natural culture resource studies. This was mapping graves on a site where they wanted to do some new walkways using some shallower piles. The red circles indicate the graves, and it's not much to see from the top down, but this is done using ground penetrating radar. So we're able to actually look at the cross-section image as well for these sites, map the areas that are consistent with formerly buried or interred individuals. So finally here, value of geophysics really, and I didn't go into too much detail on the specific methods, but almost all the methods are very non-invasive. They don't require any digging. They don't require much access more than you'd get with a normal pickup truck. We can get very fast turnaround on these, and many of these projects did have fast turnaround because, of course, they didn't discover the rubble until after they were already trying to install the piles. It does provide targets for direct exploration. So when used as part of a smart exploration plan, we can actually use those borings in a way to help investigate those existing piles of rubble fill, potentially interred individuals, things of that nature. And we can connect the dots. We can paint between the borings, something that has historically not been done. Put 4 borings on a site, call it good, but more and more of those sites have been previously developed, and you can run into a lot of surprises on those sites when you're exploring them. So overall, we've used this extensively in terms of deep foundation sites, a lot of pile driving sites, but even especially when you're dealing with drilled shafts, looking at bedrock depth in terms of how deep you think you're going to have to go to sock it into the bedrock becomes very important. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
We have a question, so.
Have you ever done in-water work, like below the water surface for obstructions or depth to rock?
Yeah, usually for stuff like that, it's for HDD crossings. We've done quite a bit of that, looking at bedrock depth. They're trying to map a soil profile below the river, so you make sure you're not drilling a pipe just into the middle of the river. But certainly for deep foundation testing, sure. Or I should say for sites with deep foundations, things like bridge abutments can be done using electric resistivity in the water or even seismic refraction and reflection in the water. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
It was really fascinating. My question is more about the limitations. Do you foresee any limitations, for example, when it comes to depth, if you're applying this technology for exploration, for example?
Sure. I mean, you have to be careful with vertical resolution. Sure, certainly the maps belie a point of how accurate is that plus or minus in terms of depth. In our case, we always correlate that with direct borings, especially over areas that are most important. But between those borings, you can lose some confidence in the depth. So for like the bedrock depth mapping, typically that's plus or minus 3 to 5 feet. The deeper you go, the less resolution you get. So if it's 50, 60 feet below ground surface, it might be plus or minus a couple of feet. As you go into the 100 plus foot, now you're getting into plus or minus 5 foot of depth. But it at least gives you an idea of, especially when you hit pockets of very deep rock and some of the more sedimentary rocks in the upper Midwest, that's where this can be particularly useful as you're driving a pile and it just doesn't seem to be any end to that pile driving operations.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank
my
you.
pleasure.
So we have talked about rock, but what about discrete obstruction in the ground, in soft ground at depth? Are there limitations to the depth and to the size of the obstruction for it to be detectable?
Sure. Yeah. The deeper the obstruction is, the larger the obstruction has to be to detect. So by the time you're at 150 feet below ground surface, you've got to be looking at school bus size objects to be able to see. So we deal more with this, say, in mining operations where they're trying to map the extent of an old mine. Sometimes those mines are only big enough to fit a person in sideways, and when they're down 200-300 feet, those really aren't detectable. So certainly very near surface rubble fill becomes easier to detect. Thankfully, we're graced by the fact that most people are pretty lazy, which is the fact that if they can bury something, they're going to bury it just deep enough so it can't be seen, and they don't usually go to the effort of burying something 100 feet below ground surface. But certainly for things like weak soil layers, bedrock depth that kind of falls off, that kind of stuff is stuff that we frequently use seismic or resistivity for. Very near surface rubble type fill is typically more GPR and electromagnetic type surveys. But if you buried something 100 feet deep that's in a barrel, good luck.
Thank you.
So you haven't been asked to find Jimmy Hoffa yet?
They don't tell me that I'm looking for Jimmy Hoffa. We're actually on two gravesite projects right now looking. Some of the more exciting work that we do is helping law enforcement try to solve some of those cases.
Any other questions? All right, great presentation.
Thank you.
Good.